Well, first of all, let me say how honored I am to be here. It has been an awesome day. I have learned so much. And if any of our opening panel are still here, I'll hear your words in my head forever. And I cried a lot this morning. And I told somebody today, I guess when I stop crying, that I ought to get out of the work. So we're charged with addressing safety planning for vulnerable populations. And when I heard the opening this morning from the elder, I didn't know much, I have to admit, about the 7 fires prophecy, so of course you Google it, right? And I found out some more. But I'm feeling like we are probably in an era where we do have to make those choices as a global planet, as a global people. And especially for someone in the States, I feel particularly vulnerable to a country's government that seems absolutely bent and determined to do more to befoul the earth and, make our waters full of disrespect. And that it's my country seems to want to go down the path of more prosperity for the few. And so does our world, rather than a good life for everyone. So, I'm going to keep that in my head and do everything I can to change the policy in my country. I like a lot of what Canada is doing now. I'm always tempted to move north, except what keeps me, of course, in my country is these grandchildren. So all of you that have heard me talk, I always start out with pictures of the grandchildren. And my piece here is to ask all of you, if anybody after the presentation has any thoughts of how I get those incredibly privileged grandchildren to really deeply recognize their privilege and to recognize the biases that I know they're growing up with. My daughter says, well, Mom, you taught us not to be racist. But I'm like, yeah, but see, that's not good enough. You have to live it. You have to think about it every day. So if you have any tips for me, let me know. Now, what I'm supposed to do is talk about safety planning for vulnerable and marginalized populations. What Myrna told me is the way it's defined in this homicide prevention initiative is Aboriginal populations, immigrant populations, rural, remote. I would say we ought to add the LGBTQ continuum to that also. Now, I'll confess from the outset, I got nothing for you in terms of rural and remote. The Intimate Partner Femicide study was done primarily on urban populations. There's a few rural cases in there. But I am thrilled that there are so many people here that are thinking about it, and I'm looking to my colleague, Donna, to address it in this presentation. The danger assessment, which many of you know about, was developed for women. It's in order to help women recognize the danger in their relationship with an abusive man. Now, part of the danger assessment, in terms of its history, I first developed it based on a small domestic violence homicide study in Dayton, Ohio, small town. And based on the work I did in that study, I realized I needed to work with abused women if I was ever going to decrease murder of women. And so I started on a journey doing that, working in leading support groups and shelters in Detroit first and then in other places in the country. And also teaching my students, my nursing students, to recognize abused women in their practice, talking to a lot of abused women and realizing they oftentimes were underestimating their risk of being killed. They would tell me the story, and I think, oh my goodness, it sounds way too much like one of those homicide cases I reviewed. But yet, I'm more scared than she is. And that's when I learned to recognize clinically that normal minimization, put it in the back of your head kind of process that women do, abused women do. And not all of them are at high risk, but those that are oftentimes underestimate their risk. So I developed the danger assessment, getting the wording for the items, and it's available on the website. It's available for free. They promised me even if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, it'll be up there for free. I've sold my soul, not totally, but the rights to Hopkins so that it will always be available. And the wording of the danger assessment came from the women. The notion of choking strangulation went on the danger assessment back in 1986 because women told me that that was one thing that scared them. That was one thing that made them think he might be capable of killing her. And the original danger assessment, I've done the danger assessment myself with 2,200 women that I have records of, and probably more than that. So I've used it, and one of the most important parts of the danger assessment is the calendar. This makes it interactive. This helps her come to her own realization of the pattern of domestic violence. It cuts through that normal minimization. Now, the calendar is built on the notion that she's strong, resourceful, smart. And like all adult learners, we learn much better. It's much more powerful if we see it for ourselves in our own situation rather than somebody telling us what to do. And this is a quote from a woman in Alberta, Canada. You actually see your own roller coaster ride. It's on the calendar. Now, it was further refined in the national U.S. domestic violence femicide study. Tested with ROC curve analysis, all of that's available, and all of the articles related to the danger assessment are on the danger assessment website. We have also developed a version for immigrant women, DAI, immigrant women, again, in the United States, so it hasn't been tested further, needs further development and testing. We're working on that right now. But that's also available on the danger assessment website. We also have a DAR for same-sex female couples, and that we're continuing to work on also. We also have a DA5, which is a short form for healthcare providers. It was actually developed mostly by a Canadian physician, Carolyn Snyder, who's now in Toronto. We have revised and worked on that further, and we have a publication coming out on that in 2018. The DALE was developed in collaboration with the Jeannie Geiger Crisis Center in order to help them identify which cases of domestic violence needed to be handled by a high-risk team. So it's calibrated slightly differently than the other danger assessments in order to do that. That DALE also, there's a publication coming out on that, but that's available on the danger assessment website. But that's more around identifying cases that need heavy-duty, highly collaborative risk management. It's also in the DOVE intervention, which is for pregnant women in prenatal, either home visitation or prenatal care. That intervention has been tested and found to significantly reduce repeat domestic violence. That's also being used in the NFP, which is the family partnership. It's the home visitation program. Oh, David Oldswood just nurse family partnership, got it. And Dana Jack and Marilyn Ford Gilbo are using the danger assessment in their home visitation programs, and they're developing an intervention specifically for NFP nurses to do with domestic violence victim. The LAP is a short form of the danger assessment, and note it's a lethality assessment protocol. It's not just a lethality assessment. There's a protocol that goes with it. And sometimes you hear people say, oh, well, we use the LAP. You know, we just ask these questions, and there we go. We know who's at high risk. The protocol that goes with it is that the police officer informs the woman or the survivor, and they're using it with males as well as females, that they are at high risk. According to the LAP, it's calibrated to overestimate risk, and gets them in touch with domestic violence advocacy right there on the scene. Doesn't give them a phone number to call that they don't, but gets them in touch with domestic violence advocates right there on the scene. Offers them the phone, they don't have to talk, but that's the protocol part. So it's not just, you know, and you may notice, all of these are intended to connect women at high risk with domestic violence services so she can make choices what to do. Wanted to give you a little bit of data from my collaboration with the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters. Carolyn Gerard is out there somewhere. This project we did many years ago, but we wanted to keep track of what happened when the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters decided that the danger assessment would be used in all of their shelters as women were admitted within the first 48 to 72 or 24 to 72 hours after admission. So domestic violence advocates were concerned about doing that with the danger assessment. They were particularly concerned about the calendar, concerned that it would re-traumatize women. So that was in part why we embarked on this research. 46% of the participants in this research were Aboriginal, 31% English Canadian, other visible minorities 7%, and 5% foreign born. So importantly, the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters wanted to modify the calendar, which anybody's free to do, anything they want to do to make it better for women to fill out. They wanted to add emotional abuse as well as the physical abuse, the 1 through 5 on the calendar. They wanted to add emotional abuse, financial abuse, sexual assault, and spiritual abuse, and how often that happened, and put it on the calendar. One thing that we're doing now with all of our calendars is actually adding when choking or strangulation happens on the calendar. So we had 180 respondents who gave us in-depth, it wasn't in-depth interviews, it was they gave us the answer to open-ended questions about what it was like for you to complete the danger assessment and the calendar. And the thematic analysis, first of all, a lot of women said, yeah, it's hard to do. It's distressing, it's upsetting. A lot of women cried. But it was also part of a healing process. First of all, by increasing awareness, decreasing minimization. I love that quote about I'm always trying to minimize my experiences, and she hadn't even been to support group yet. So I don't know how she learned that terminology. So she already had that in her head. But then also women talking about it being a healing experience. I love that in terms of loosen my breathing, which we know is something that we do when we do finally start to relax. Also increase their realization of danger. And the theme of strengthening resolve, those quotes, and those are just examples of quotes, there was many other women that said something like this, is what makes me feel like the danger assessment is worth doing in terms of strengthening women's resolve. So also we measured the outcomes, and those of you that are researchers in the room, this was lousy research. It was pre-post only. It was, it's not, no control group, none of that good stuff, no follow-up over time, but just pre-post in terms of women marking their danger more after doing the danger assessment. Well, that makes sense. But the ready to take action, significantly more. Ready to get help from the shelter personnel and ready to get help from police. So based on that work with Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, we also worked with the Indigenous shelter directors and their staff in order to make the danger assessment more culturally appropriate for Indigenous women in the on-reserve shelters. And so they came up with the DA circle design. It's part of the Walking the Path project that was for children who were in homes where there had been domestic violence, Indigenous children. So it was designed to be a little bit more culturally appropriate, using culturally significant symbols on the calendar, and also doing the calendar in a month process, more appropriate, not month, a season process, more appropriate to a medicine wheel type concept. And women, rather than the regular danger assessment calendar, women are asked to work backwards, starting with yesterday, and work backwards because we remember yesterday better than further back. But to take advantage of the more storytelling traditions, women were told to dive into any season they wanted to and work backwards and forwards within that season to mark the abusive incidents, as is done on the regular danger assessment. Now, we have not formally tested the DA circle, but the notion of safety planning based in part, at least, on the danger assessment is that women are aware of the level of danger in their situation, their risk of homicide. That's one piece of information that they need in order to do safety planning, I believe. And ideally coming to that realization herself rather than being told. But if she is told, if it's by a healthcare provider or the police or a domestic violence advocate, look, you're at high risk. If you do the weighted scoring on the danger assessment, you're at extreme danger. That this gives her a voice saying, and she may have suspected it all along. We have some quotes from some other women. One woman said, "Hey, this is no news flash. I knew he was scary. But this does give me some backing to push the system more." So then the safety planning you can do is based in part on how dangerous he is. And then the safety planning needs to be contextualized to her situation, to her culture, to other sources of discrimination and violence against her, so that it's not just about her personal situation, so that it's also the context has to take into account. And Diane Redsky was talking today about her program, the Spirit of Peace program, which I think is awesome, where and she can talk to you more about it if you're interested. Then we developed the My Plan app. Now, Nancy Glass, my colleague, my friend, was the one that first developed the My Plan app, but the danger assessment is in it. And importantly, I don't know if this will work, yeah. So the danger assessment, the woman is asked, first of all, a little bit about her background. If she says she's in a relationship with another woman, and there's problems in the relationship, there's some first identification that the relationship has issues. The word violence is avoided at the beginning. Let me back up a little bit. It can also be done by a family member or a friend. So if it's not by the woman herself and identifies that at first, starts off with internet safety app safety strategies, et cetera. There's a get out of this app and go to a planning your, I don't know what it is, your work life or something. It goes straight to that if you want it to. So there is some safety strategies built into that app. You can also see the little leaf that's on the front of it, and it just says My Plan. So it's not it doesn't scream out abuse or circle of safety or anything like that. And then it asks her what her priorities are in life. Are her priorities her children? Which, every abused woman I've ever talked to that has children, that's number one. But if she doesn't have children, then the safety planning that's offered is not about children. And then after it goes through some relationship myths, and that's one of the things we're tailoring to Indigenous women in our work with the My Plan. Then it asks the questions that are on the danger assessment, and it scores it for her. And you can see there it gives where she is on the levels of danger. And we did some work with some women that said, 6 months later, they said, oh, I was in the red zone. I remember that about that app. I don't remember anything else, but I do remember I was in the red zone. So it's a powerful message of where she is in terms of risk of homicide. Then it tailors, and it's brilliant programming. James Case is the person that programmed it. It tailors the safety strategies that are offered to her, to that background information, to her priorities, and to her level of danger. And so this does not take the place of domestic violence advocacy, but it's an extra tool that we can use for people that aren't ready to talk to you wonderful, fabulous, best people advocates. And that's always one of the choices that's given, is in the United States, it's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Now there's a Canadian version called I Can that Marilyn Ford Gilbo has developed, and they've done an evaluation of it. Those results are in, it's not yet published, and they're eventually planning to get it in the App Store also. The only one that's in the App Store now, both kinds of app stores, is the My Plan. It's also iSafe in New Zealand, and the evaluation of iSafe in New Zealand was very effective for Maori women, even though it was not specifically tailored that way. So what we're doing now in the United States, we're trying to develop an Indigenous version of My Plan. I have a team of Indigenous researchers that are in charge of it. We started out with in-depth interviews of service providers and abused Indigenous women. It will have the DA circle in there for the danger assessment. By the way, in My Plan, if you say you're in a relationship with another woman, you get the DAR rather than the regular danger assessment. We're tailoring the priorities, the myths, the safety planning strategies for Indigenous women in the United States. We'll get to Canada one of these days. And we're also doing the same thing with the same grant money from NIH, so we can't go global. But and we're calling it, by the way, Our Circle. You can see a pattern in these things. And the immigrant version of My Plan is going to be called We Women. And it's based on the danger assessment for immigrant women, doing the same kinds of cultural adaptation as for Our Circle. Like, for instance, in Our Circle, a lot of the safety planning strategies are reconnecting with your spiritual practices, your traditional practices, those kinds of things like what I've been hearing about today. I Can, that team here in Canada, like I said, the findings are in press, and there's an I Heal online strategy that was also developed by Marilyn Ford-Gilbo for healing after abuse. And there's a team in BC, Colleen Varco and her team, in working with Aboriginal women for healing after abuse. And I do believe healing from the trauma has to be part of safety planning strategies, that we have to pay attention to healing. And I think we have to pay attention to that in our prevention programs, our dating violence prevention programs. We have to pay attention to people's experiences of trauma, whether they're Aboriginal or immigrant coming from another land, etc. That has to be part of our safety planning strategies. And I finished on time. What do you think?
Wonderful. I'm really pleased to be here and tell you a little bit about my experience doing research with intimate partner violence in rural New Brunswick, and eventually domestic homicide, female domestic homicide research for the New Brunswick Silent Witness Project. I just want to give you sort of a face of rurality in New Brunswick. We have consistently, over 100 years, been one of the most rural provinces in all of Canada. The urban rural population, the development split in New Brunswick is 1-to-1. So 48% of New Brunswickers live in rural communities, and in the 2011 census, that means in communities with less than 1,000, population of less than 1,000. I think it's sort of interesting that the rural-urban split in New Brunswick today reflects the divide in Ontario in 1921 and Quebec in 1911. So we're only a century behind in terms of that rural-urban divide. But it very much, we're not a remote province. We're not huge with long, long distances between communities, but we are a very rural province. And I first began doing domestic violence research in 1994 when Dr. Jenny Hornesty, a sociologist at UNB, became the chair of one of the first 4 teams, original teams of the Muriel McQueen Ferguson Center for Family Violence Research. And I'd been doing focus groups with rural folks on how to deliver law information in a way that reflected the lived reality of people in New Brunswick. And Jenny invited me to join that team. And so I was pleased, and as a sort of a frontline service provider, my board said, you know, we can't support you to be off doing research and interviews if it's curiosity-based. It can't just be, oh, isn't it nice to have more information? It has to be, something is going to come out of this to improve women's safety, how we share information to make things safer for women, how they access law information. So that was always part of being involved in research, was to respond to the needs of the people who were victims of family violence, perpetrators, service providers, police, and so on. I guess before I talk about the domestic homicide, Jenny and I have a lot of publications, and you can read about that. So I can't go into it with only a few minutes, but you know, we found that the factors that were keeping women in abusive relationships, women could name them. They could talk about what inhibited their help-seeking behavior. And because it was participatory action research, they would tell us, this is what we need to feel safer, this is what would help us to leave. But please respect the fact that sometimes it may sound counterintuitive, but we feel safer staying than leaving. When I leave, I don't know what he's going to be thinking, doing, and what might happen. But when I'm there, I can read his moods, I can shut him down, police won't be here for an hour and a half, so I know how to make myself safe, and you have to respect that. So it was interesting, and you know, there were 2 or 3 things that stand out in that early research. One was the over and over again hearing about firearms and how they were in all rural homes, and they could often create a very real sense of imminent danger because of threats of suicide, serious drinking, and depression. And when all of those things were happening, women would say, it's the firearms in the house that are particularly disturbing. They also talked about their pets. And later, Jenny and I did a study on pets and firearms in rural homes in PEI and New Brunswick. And there were over 400 women going into transition houses that year. 70% had pets. Of those, 45% said the pets had been harmed, and of those, 40% said the pets had been killed, sometimes with their children witnessing it. So, you know, those were things we were putting out there, and I was at the time thinking, well, there's domestic homicide risk factors, but they're probably quite different, because we were being cautioned, don't extrapolate the same types of risk factors and interconnections in intimate partner violence and domestic homicide factors. But lo and behold, when I began to do domestic homicide research, I was quite surprised that, yes, they do parallel each other, that these factors that we found in rural communities were there in the domestic homicide research as well that I was doing for the New Brunswick Silent Witness Project. In that project, one of the things I found was that the clustering of risk factors was quite different than the national. I mean, a risk factor is a risk factor, but if you say, here's the top 5, and I'm thinking of like the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review in 2008, and it would say, here are the factors, you know, and the number 1 most common factor was pending or actual separation. And yet, what I was finding was that was not the number 1 factor. There were other factors. So just to share a few, because we don't have a lot of time, 70% of the women who were killed in New Brunswick were killed in small towns, rural locations. Well, that's not surprising. We're a rural province. But when you realize that in Ontario, the vast majority of women who were killed in domestic homicides, it happened, 55%, were killed in cities with populations of 500,000 to over 1 million. The population of our whole province is only 785,000. So, you know, a very different dynamic going on there. So some of the factors that were quite different in addition to just rurality, geography being something that was quite different, is the women were killed while living together. So about 65% of the New Brunswick women were in intact relationships. Now that doesn't mean, and Jackie has spoken about this, that they hadn't gone back and forth, but at the time they were killed, they were in a relationship in the same home, living together. And so that number 1 recommendation that we have to promote safer leaving. Women have to get out quickly and safely and stay out safely. Yes, of course, we want the women in New Brunswick, 35% that leave and stay away to get out quickly and safely. But it just seemed that there was nothing for the women who did stay or returned. And victim services in New Brunswick, if you were dealing with the police, they would support you. You would have a danger assessment, you'd have a risk assessment, and you could do a safety plan. But you needed to be cooperating with the police. And so often women would say, okay, he's apologized, I want that no contact condition varied, we're moving back together. And there was nothing for women to mitigate their risk when they did return or if they stayed. So the 55% of the women in New Brunswick were killed, and this is about 45 cases that I look at. So I know it's not statistically significant, but it's enough that it's a trend that gives you cause to think about what we need to do. So 55% of the women were killed with firearms, but that's hunting rifles and shotguns, not handguns. Somebody said, oh, well, you went back to 1990. Your research covered a 20-year span. So things have changed. It's not like that anymore. So I had 1990 to 2010, and then I took 2010 to now and did the research all over, divided it up. And since 2010, it's still been 55% were killed with hunting rifles or firearms. It hadn't changed at all, just to look at more recent data. The murder-suicide, over 2/3 of the women were killed in murder-suicides, and more recently it seems to have escalated. In 2010 to 2005, there were 17 female domestic homicides, and 14 were murder-suicides. And they get buried, they get hidden. You don't know a lot because they don't get much coverage. They're not reported, they can't be talked about. Privacy laws and so on. And so in terms of saying in the interest of public safety, what can we learn? It's hard to learn anything from some of these deaths. 66% of the women were in common law relationships. Only 16.7% of census families in Canada are common law. In Ontario, 48% of the women were killed by a common law partner. And so I don't know what that risk factor means, and it's a well-known, that you're at greater risk if you're in a common law relationship. Alcohol, in New Brunswick, 75% of the court cases were said at sentencing, or the judge found that they were serious drinking involved, and about 70% were said to have serious addiction problems. And again, in Ontario, that was quite a bit lower. It was 42% involves excessive alcohol. So different dynamics. And when I present the findings in rural New Brunswick, people go, oh, well, of course, that's not a surprise to us. What's there to do on a Saturday night in New Brunswick in the summer? You look at your calendar. The majority of deaths were in the spring, summer months. So to deal with those differences, we decided to create a safety plan that would reflect the factors that were most common in New Brunswick. So this is what tomorrow I'll be talking about in my workshop, is the actual safety plan that we have created for women living in abusive relationships. And I'm pleased to say Victim Services has purchased, adopted, taken this on as a safety planning tool that they will use with women. And so if women say, I'm not cooperating anymore, I want to go back, I'm leaving, I've gone back, before a judge is supposed to, there's no counting for what a judge might do, but before the judge will remove the variance, he's supposed to say, you must go back to Victim Services and do this safety plan for living in an abusive relationship. And then there's 16 factors or situations that could put her at risk, and she doesn't have to choose all 16 and deal with them, only the ones that she feels are doable at the time or that she'd like to address. That could be threats of suicide, it could be the firearms in the home. One of the strategies when we did training for the victim service workers, and we were talking about how they could support women in some of these situations that put them at risk, we gave all the victim service workers across the province trigger locks, because women were saying the guns are out in the open, they don't, are under the bed, and they don't have They're not stored properly, they're not safe, yet they all are very concerned about their children, and they're great dads, so the idea was, let's put trigger locks on the guns so that the kids stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Peter and Myrna, for the opportunity to speak here today. It's an honor to be speaking to you today and in this place, and with my esteemed co-panelists. Okay, so in its second domestic homicide brief, the initiative said that those conducting risk assessments should use structured, reliable, validated, and defensible risk assessment tools or guidelines. So the initiative doesn't have a position on which approach or which tool to be using. And you, at this conference, have been hearing about a number of tools that are structured, validated tools. And I'm going to be focusing on one approach, the actuarial approach, and in particular on the Ontario Domestic Assault Risk Assessment, or Adhara, which is an actuarial tool. So actuarial has to do with the statistical calculation of risk. It's an approach that's used in many fields, including the insurance industry and medical health, and as it turns out, in violence risk assessment as well. Actuarial methods have to do with measuring risks or potential risk factors at a given point in time, and then following up a sample or a group, in this case domestic offenders, for example, following them up and measuring the outcome as well, so that every item that's on an actuarial tool is a risk factor that has been shown to be measured at one time and related to an outcome at a later time. So this, an actuarial tool is scored. Each item on an actuarial tool has a score, and the total score is the conclusion of the tool to an extent is the sum of all the item scores, and that sum relates to an individual's estimated risk and also a rank order, so how an individual compares with other domestic offenders who have been assessed. So, as I said, actuarial tools are used in a variety of fields, including medical risk assessment. And I was actually able to go online and evaluate my own risk of developing breast cancer. So this tool allowed me to enter my individual level, my own information, and it told me two things. One, it told me what my risk of developing breast cancer is in my lifetime, up to the age of 90, which might be a little optimistic. But secondly, it also told me how my risk compares to others based on large studies. So an actuarial tool can tell you both individual information to help you either communicate to a victim that you're supporting, or help you make decisions about an individual perpetrator that you may be treating or deciding on a variety of different risk management strategies for. But it also helps at a more population level or policy level, because planning can be made for how many people you may expect to need certain resources for. And in particular, actuarial tools fit with the risk, need, and responsivity principles, whereby we give the most risk management interventions or actions to those people who represent the highest risk of either perpetration or victimization. So the Adhara, being an actuarial tool, gives this kind of information. It can be presented in a figure like this. So for people who are comfortable with reading figures or enjoy the statistics, this table, this figure can tell us a number of things. First, it tells us that with increasing Adhara scores along the bottom, you see increasing risk of domestic violence recidivism. It also tells us that, it shows that we have done a number of studies and found the same pattern, validating the Adhara in different studies. The line also shows the distribution, or a summary we can take from that is that at the extreme ends of risk, we see relatively fewer perpetrators. And this is based on research with male perpetrators of domestic violence. The results don't have to be displayed in a figure like this. They can also be summarized in a table that we would call an actuarial table. And here you would find the Adhara score down the first column, and you can look over to see an individual's estimated risk in the next column. And perhaps more importantly, the other columns also show where an individual stands with respect to others who have been assessed on the Adhara. It can also be communicated like this, and these pie charts were suggested to us by nurses who were working with female victims of domestic violence at Ontario's sexual assault and domestic violence treatment centres. They found this was a more user-friendly communication for their clients, but it still also shows the estimated risk in the shaded areas of the graph and where people stand with respect to each other by looking at the whole row, the whole column of the pie charts. It can also be expressed like this, which to me is quite user-friendly and very similar to what I received when I assessed my risk for developing breast cancer. So I've mentioned the Adhara. I haven't really talked about what the Adhara is other than an actuarial tool. This is a screenshot from Adhara 101, our online training for the tool. And this is a piece that you would see after doing the learning modules and when you've been through some practice videos and you get the opportunity to practice scoring the Adhara and each individual item. So the first few items have to do with the perpetrator's criminal history, such as prior domestic assault and a police or criminal record. The 3 items after that have to do with things that occurred at the most recent domestic assault, like threats, confinement, the victim's concern about future assaults. And the remaining items have to do with aspects of the relationship and the circumstances, their children, any assaults during pregnancy, barriers to accessing support, and so on. So that's just a brief summary of the Adhara. And now I would like to talk a little bit about choosing a risk assessment tool. I have just picked out 5 different principles in choosing a tool, and each agency or jurisdiction needs to choose the tool or the approach that is right for them, that's going to be the most effective in supporting their risk management procedures. So validation refers to whether a tool has been tested, especially in multiple studies, to make sure that the tool itself or the items on that tool or the summary statements from that tool are actually related to domestic violence recidivism in the case of the tools that we're talking about. And all the major tools that you're hearing about at this conference have been validated. I would include in validation inter-rater reliability or agreement. That is, if I score the Adhara in a particular situation and Peter scores the Adhara in the same situation, do we come up with the same score? Because if we are scoring the Adhara differently, if it's a different score every time, then it can't be used in a valid way. And we have done a number of studies on the Adhara finding that we have good agreement in that way. Generalization has to do with, okay, we've maybe validated the tool in one sort of population. Does it generalize to another population? So here's where we want to see studies done in different countries and so on, or in different settings, such as the victim advocacy setting or the police or corrections setting. Generalization also, in domestic violence risk assessment, there is a big issue with whether tools that are developed for male perpetrators with female victims will generalize to female perpetrators or to perpetrators and victims in a same-sex relationship. We do have a number of studies now validating the Adhara for female perpetrators, and we want to see more happening in that direction. And we are hoping to see more work done, or at least some work done with the Adhara in same-sex relationship violence. And that really is an area that is a current challenge for domestic violence risk assessment for all our tools. Information has to do with whether you have the information needed to complete the risk assessment tool or approach that you want to use. For example, the Adhara was developed for frontline use with victims or in policing circumstances. But we have a sister tool called the DV-RAG that requires using the psychopathy checklist, which is a restricted psychological tool that takes a lot of background information. So depending on your circumstance, you may not be able to use that tool. So that's part of that decision about the choice. Communication is another issue. Is this something, a tool that's going to help you communicate back back to the people you serve, perhaps to share the information with a victim who has given you her information. How do you share that back with her in terms of a risk assessment result? And does that help her make decisions about her own safety and move forward? Is this a tool that police can use also to communicate with the courts, or with probation, and can shelter staff use this tool with their clients and then communicate with their local policing services about the level of risk in an individual case or in general in the community that they're serving? And my final point is about education. So you've selected a tool. Can you access the education that you might need? Is there education needed for this tool? Is it accessible? Is it affordable? Is it timely? Can you get if you have a crew of staff you want trained, can you make sure that your training needs are met? So I've said a little bit about Adhara 101. I'm not going to say any more at this point, but we do have a showcase out there in the break if you want to come see me there. So just in summarizing about risk management and safety planning, I think both of these processes consist of all the decisions that we make, whether it's about a perpetrator, we need to decide what's going to happen, or in a victim's case, if they're deciding, making a number of decisions for their own safety. We make decisions with relation to risk management and safety planning all the time. And it's always with some notion of risk in mind, whether it's a gut reaction, a gut sense of what this perpetrator might be capable of, or whether it's a structured, validated, scored tool, or however it may be. If we're using structured, validated tools, we can increase the effectiveness of our risk management and safety planning. Actuarial tools especially are designed to work with the principles of effective intervention so that we can be doing the most intensive, the most extensive, the broadest risk management for perpetrators who represent the highest risk. And we can be planning for this at a policy level as well. Okay, well, then, thank you very much for your attention. And I will hand over to our next speaker.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this challenging topic. So we had talked about how to make this sort of the most practically useful talk, and well, at least I talked about this with Peter. We thought talking about this issue of linking intimate partner violence risk assessment to risk management is a very important one, because it's always been our philosophy that risk assessment is nothing without good risk management plans. Risk assessment is nothing if it can't inform us about actually what to do with the case. But before I get into that, I think I had to put this in here because when I was putting these slides together, my daughter emailed me this picture. This is the puppy that she's finally getting after asking for a puppy for 5 years. So I thought it can't hurt to show a puppy at a conference like this. Yesterday was really heavy, so I'm pretty excited to meet this little girl. So I learned the hard way when I first started doing threat assessments. I can remember I was doing a dangerous offender assessment. I went through, and I thought I was pretty smart, and I went through and I used all the available tools. It was a sex offender who had also had a history of domestic violence. And I did my risk assessment, I sent it into the court, and I got a polite response. Thank you very much, Dr. Kropp, but could you provide us with some useful information? And I thought, well, and I almost retired at that point. But the response was, can you actually tell us what to do with this case? Because what we're struggling with here in court is, can we manage this person in the community? If we place him in the community, how can we prevent him from reoffending? So that experience and others really influenced our approach to developing risk assessment measures. And the whole idea would be, can we developed something like the SARA, which was the Spousal Assault Risk Assessment Guide, was the first tool we developed. There's sort of a one-stop shopping where we can actually guide people through the entire process of risk assessment and to the point where they're making good risk management plans. So it's a process that we're actually trying, with the tools that I've been involved in developing, that we're trying to actually help people through. We think people, regardless of where you're working, whether it's victims, offenders, you are doing risk assessments, threat assessments anyways, whether you're using a tool or not. We wanted to basically guide you through that process in the most structured way possible. So there's sort of 4 general principles or steps that I would suggest are important. The first is to identify risk factors, then to think about the actual relevance of those risk factors, to think about risk scenarios, and then build management plans on top of those scenarios. So let me just walk through this. So when we're thinking about identifying risk factors, you've seen lots of risk tools, and there's lots of these lists of risk factors, and I echo Zoe's thoughts about this. We have to focus on risk factors that have some empirical relevance in the literature whenever possible. So we want risk factors that have been validated in the literature and show some predictive accuracy. Our approach is a little different in that we would also want to include risk factors that we believe might be difficult to empirically validate, but might have some professional and practical utility in the sense that the professional consensus out there is that there are some risk factors that are important to consider that may be difficult or rare or hard to validate. And then there's the whole legal question about using risk factors that are fair, that don't discriminate. They don't use ascribed characteristics of individuals. So, we can't talk about skin color, even if there was, an empirical association between skin color and violent behavior. It's unhelpful to do that. It's discriminatory, and it's not actually addressing what the underlying risk is. So, risk factors need to be fair and reasonable. You'll see, I agree with Zoe that we have to use structure. If we do threat assessments without any structure, we do not get reliable risk assessments. It's as simple as that, and the literature and the research is pretty clear about that. Risk assessments need to be contextual, so we need to always think about the individual case that we're assessing and think about the context in which that violence is occurring in that family. So we believe in thinking about static and dynamic and flexible risk factors in the assessment. So this is just the Be Safer. So this is an example of the structured professional judgment approach to risk assessment. Some of you will be familiar with the Be Safer. It was like our shortened version of the SARA. So you can see we have risk factors related to the violence itself. So we think about violent acts, threats, escalation of that violence, violation of court orders, and attitudes that support or condone violence. We think about the psychosocial adjustment of the perpetrator. So think about general criminal attitudes, behaviors, intimate relationship problems, substance use problems, mental health problems, and so forth. And then finally, victim vulnerability factors. Attitudes and behaviors of the victim, and this is not, of course, to hold victims responsible for the violence that's being perpetrated against them, but it's understanding the vulnerabilities and barriers. So fear, support networks, living situation, health problems, and so forth. So a lot of you work with victims. This is basically the stuff of a good safety plan. This is important because, again, we're going to see that risk management, as I define it, will include victim safety planning. We can't do risk management of the offender without considering victim safety planning with the victim. It's two sides of the same coin. So the next thing is, well, risk factor can be there historically, but is it actually relevant? We can go through a list of risk factors and check off a number of factors, but we don't actually think they're relevant right now to the risk that this person poses. So we ask people to think about, Does the risk factor actually have some kind of causal relationship to this person's violence? And I'm talking about this later this afternoon in more detail, but we can think about relevance in a number of different ways, but we think about, does it motivate the person to be violent? Is he motivated by revenge, or is he motivated by power and control? Is he motivated by proximity to the victim, affiliation? There's a number of different reasons why men are violent, and women. The other way a risk factor can be relevant, it's actually just going to complicate management for us. So it's going to make it difficult to implement good management strategies. So a risk factor can, we take a decision-making model with risk assessment, and we think that violence is a decision. And what we want to try to understand is, why is this perpetrator deciding to behave this way? So we want to try to, in a way, get into his head and think about what's he trying to accomplish, what might be disinhibiting him, so preventing him from appreciating the consequences of the behavior, both to himself and to the victim. And then what factors might be destabilizing him, screwing up his thinking, just affecting his ability to make good decisions. And it's risk factors that are impinging on the decisions, and that's how we decide which risk factors we want to really focus on. This isn't as difficult to do as you might expect if we actually put in some structure to the process. The next stage we would talk about is developing scenarios. Now, this again is a process where we want people to step back and think about, what bad things are we worried about here? Now, this is something that we do naturally anyways. I mean, anyone that works with victims or offenders has those sleepless nights. You're thinking, what is going to happen tomorrow? Is that guy going to do it? Is he going to kill her? Is he going to abduct her and the children? We are running these scenarios, usually very bad scenarios, through our heads all the time. And that's how we think we build good plans. We can't build management strategies without having a good plan and without understanding what it is we're worried about that the perpetrator is going to do. So we have to think about what that person's done in the past. So we look at all the past and previous patterns of their violence, and that's going to tell us a lot. We also want to consider any development of new patterns of behavior or evolution of IPV. And we can do this kind of by considering a number of different scenarios. So the easiest one for us to think about always is the repeat scenario. We can think about is it likely that this person's just going to continue doing what he's always been doing, the same sort of simple pathway. Now the problem with only considering that is that offenders are creative. They can change. They evolve. So we have to not just assume that violence is always going to be the same. A threat assessment has to consider a twist, a possible change in the motivation. The victims, we know that there are possible multiple victims of violence, not just maybe the obvious person, but it might be the new boyfriend, the children, the mother-in-law, and so forth. Are the behaviors going to change? So thinking outside the box, that's how we prepare ourselves. This is how people do this in emergency planning. We have to think, if an earthquake were to hit Vancouver, that's my hometown, tomorrow, are we prepared? We do that by trying to imagine all the different possible outcomes. The one we're always concerned about, and it's relevant to this conference, is the lethality or worst case scenario, and I'm going to be talking about that in some detail this afternoon. We always want to ask that question: is this going to escalate to lethal violence? And if it is, how does that unfold? What is going to have to happen for that to take place? If we can do that, now we start to get somewhere. We're thinking about what warning signs we're going to be looking for. We, of course, want to imagine an improvement scenario. Sadly, those aren't always very common. So always consider in our scenarios the nature, severity of the violence, the imminence of the violence, the likelihood, and as I said just a minute ago, think outside the box on the victims, because again, we can have multiple possible victims. We can even have multiple perpetrators, right? So if we think that in extended family violence, sometimes we call this so-called honor-based violence, or on a scenario of that nature, we might have multiple perpetrators and multiple victims. So it can get actually complicated. The notion that intimate partner violence is always one perpetrator, one victim, in my experience, and I think yours as well, is not typically the case. We often have many people we're concerned about. So the last step then, in our process, and this is what we want to train people to think about, is how do we then link the risk management plans to our scenarios, to our identified risk factors. So we're going to target the relevant risk factors. If it's substance abuse, we're going to try to make some recommendations about how to manage that. If it's issue about static security for the victim, security around her home or workplace, we're going to try to address that. We want to specify be as specific as possible as we can, tailor our plans to individual cases. Every case is different. The strategies, I can't say the word strategies at 8:30 in the morning, but they should be feasible, practical, and contextual. So you can go through a laundry list and ask for the world in your risk management recommendations and say, he should be getting this world-class treatment and she should be getting all these support. But if we don't have the resources, it's really kind of a useless recommendation to make. So we always ask you to think, let's stick to reality. Let's make recommendations that are actually practical and useful. And the last point here is that whenever possible, we should be linking a risk management strategy to an individual or agency. So somebody has to own it. Somebody has to take ownership for the intervention. Or again, it's kind of useless. The reports will just drift. Nobody will read them. So who's responsible for what? And a multi-agency approach, I think, is the way to go. I mentioned in the ICAT teams here, it's the multi-agency approach that I know the best, that's used in a lot of communities in BC. Debbie Hamilton, who was instrumental in developing these things, we worked together. I think that kind of approach where everybody can, if you can get through the information sharing protocols and sit together and identify the high-risk cases and work together, identify who's doing what, that's the way to go. I understand it's not always practical, but that's what I would recommend. We have to be aspirational here, try to get to the point where we can do that. But I understand it's not always practical. So the strategies, I've run out of time, but the strategies that we would say, this is a risk management plan. If we can't address these 4 areas, we haven't actually got a risk management plan in place. We have to think about monitoring strategies, very active monitoring, supervision, what controls, restrictions are we going to place on that perpetrator, what treatment or rehabilitation recommendations we're going to make for the perpetrator, and how are we going to enhance the victim's safety. Not any one person or agency can do all this. That's why the multi-agency approach is really important. Agencies need to communicate about what they're doing, and I honestly believe that's the best way we can go with this. I'm really blowing it, I'm sorry, but we actually have direct prompts, questions to ask about those 4 areas, and to remind people what the goal is, what the ultimate task is, and that is risk management. We should really just call it risk management. I think that's a better term for what we're trying to do here. Thank you.
There are many barriers to people in rural areas receiving services, including risk assessment, and I'll speak about some of the work that we've done in Saskatchewan and some opportunities for improving our practice of risk assessment for people in rural and remote communities. The unique risks in rural areas make it harder for people to leave violent relationships and also change the way that we engage in violence risk assessment. Geographic and social isolation mean that people often aren't reaching out to the services, and the opportunities for risk assessment can be missed. We also know that if a rural woman leaves a relationship and stays in her community, her ex-partner often knows where she lives. So what we see is women who are choosing between staying in the relationship and going very far away, where they're giving up connections with family, friends, their job, and often their culture. There's huge financial barriers to leaving, especially for farm women whose financial future is tied up in their land, their crops, and their animals. And there's a shortage of services, and not just shelter services, but services for perpetrators and other services such as addictions services as well. Research and experience tells us that rural women are less likely to separate, more likely to suffer assaults after they separate, and for a number of reasons, they're less likely to involve police. So we know that if someone isn't planning to leave a violent relationship, they need to have access to risk assessment so that they can help to make choices that are going to keep themselves safer. Oops. So the goal of risk assessment is to help us look at past violence to predict the likelihood of future violence, with the goal of preventing another violent incident rather than just reacting when it happens. Domestic violence death reviews have acknowledged a number of factors that may not be contained in the actuarial risk assessment tools, which are often shorter lists of the most salient risk factors. While some of these risk factors may not be part of the empirical factors contained in a risk assessment tool, they're relevant when formulating risk management and safety plans with clients. So while the items contained in the risk assessment tools help us to approximate an individual's risk, additional information may be important for discussing with our clients and when helping to formulate those safety plans. So, for example, we know that many risk assessment tools do not contain animals, but the literature and research that we were part of in Saskatchewan shows us that animals are a significant risk factor. When animals are being harmed, people are being harmed. And further to that, ownership of animals is a major barrier to rural women leaving relationships. So therefore, it's important to take this information into account when formulating safety plans, and it's also important to have information sharing plans in place with other professionals like animal welfare service providers so that they can reach out and communicate when they're seeing warning signs. At PATHS, we provide training on the Adhara to our member agency staff, who are domestic violence shelters and services across Saskatchewan. When we were in the process of choosing a tool that would be used by domestic violence service providers, we considered a number of factors. First, we chose the Adhara because of its high reliability and validity. We needed a tool that would produce consistent results no matter which staff member was using it, and would allow us to communicate those results to law enforcement, with police having an understanding of what those numbers meant. While not all detachments are using the Adhara, many police in the province are using it. It's also used by victim services and by probation, and we know that it's being used in a number of other jurisdictions. So this made it a good choice for us, knowing that our staff would be speaking the same language as other professionals, including those who are working with offenders. Further, this tool is easy to use and quick to score, which was important to us. We needed a tool that could easily be added to the intake assessment information and other information that shelter staff are already collecting without making it too onerous on both the clients and the staff. We needed to ensure that it would be feasible to conduct a risk assessment with every woman who came into the shelter service who agreed to do so. I think a risk assessment tool in a domestic violence shelter or counseling agency needs to be accessible, affordable, and easily rolled out to large staff teams. And we know that the staff in the rural agencies have limited access to post-secondary training and to professional development training in general. They have to go to urban centers to access that training, and the costs for nonprofit agencies to allow them to go and receive that training are exponential. So we've been trying to find ways to make this effective to provide so that all staff are getting it. Further, domestic violence professionals come from a variety of educational backgrounds, so it's necessary to choose a risk assessment tool that can be used by all staff who are working with clients. We provide a one-day in-person training on the Adhara, and our member agencies have also participated in the Adhara 101 online. And in the process of getting everyone trained and implementing the tool, we've come across a few challenges. And the first one is staff turnover. So while we'll get a number of staff trained in an agency, turnover will happen, and we might end up with only a couple people left who are using the tool or who have the training. So then it'll sort of fall off. So we found that we have to continually be doing updated training and support to keep everyone, to make sure that everyone in the agency has access to that training, because the staff are often working long shifts and they're working alone. So it doesn't work for them to wait to refer to their colleague who comes in on the next shift to do that risk assessment. We have to make sure that everyone has access to the training so that they can provide it to the clients when the clients need. We've also noticed that the training and the case materials don't necessarily reflect the complex situations that our staff see when they're working with rural women or women from diverse backgrounds. And another thing is that we've noticed the staff can correctly score an Adhara when they're verbally communicating with a client or when they're scoring it off of the case videos. But when we provide the written certification test, sometimes people find it difficult. And I think that's because it's a lengthy test, it's written, and it involves police reports, which is different from the actual practice of how a domestic violence shelter staff would score an Adhara. So we're currently working with Zoe and her colleagues to address all of these challenges, to make the Adhara training more effective and to make it more accessible to our staff, especially in the rural areas. And further, in rural and remote areas, there aren't always shelters or domestic violence counseling agencies available. So it's often going to be a police officer or a medical professional that someone might be seeing in a situation of domestic violence. And in urban centers, there's specialized domestic violence units within policing. But in rural and remote, officers are expected to respond to all types of calls and to be able to handle it without that specialized support to be able to follow up. So therefore, it's even more necessary to ensure that staff in the rural areas are receiving that training. And just to touch briefly on this, because it's a longer topic, but as we're providing the Adhara training, PADS also provides training for our member agency staff on trauma and violence-informed practice. And as agencies have been examining their own practices in the process of becoming more trauma and violence-informed, some have initiated conversations about how risk assessment fits within a trauma and violence-informed framework. And I think this is an important conversation to be having because all areas of our practice need to fit within trauma and violence-informed thinking. And to us at PADS, being trauma-informed means collaborating and giving women choices with an emphasis on safety. I think it's entirely possible to do risk assessment in a trauma-informed way, and I would argue that to be trauma-informed, we should be giving access to all of the tools that we have available, and we should be giving women choices to have risk assessment done. Risk assessment tools are important because they provide a shared language between service providers, but we need to standardize the training and we need to standardize what tools we're using. To properly assess risk, we need to look at both victim and perpetrator factors. We know that when we're using the Adhara, that accuracy is greatly improved when we have information from both sides. But this is not possible without collaboration between police and agencies that work with victims and agencies that work with perpetrators. To do this, we need to understand that safety and working to prevent future domestic assaults and domestic homicides needs to come before concerns about information sharing between our sectors. Communication must also improve among family and criminal courts and among the courts and the service providers that are offering these services. Courts should be requesting risk assessments and be taking those results into account. It's crucial to discuss the results of risk assessment with the individuals that are impacted, both people who are survivors of violence and people who are using violence. And referrals must be made in a holistic way. So as well as violence treatment programs, it might be important to be offering things like substance use or financial counseling, and it's especially relevant in rural communities where there might not be a specific violence treatment program available, and we need to be a little more creative in terms of what we're offering and how we're connecting people with services. We also know that relying on law enforcement and physical separation through things like no contact orders isn't enough for rural women, especially given additional barriers with geographic and social isolation and reduced police response time. So it's necessary to make sure that these women are having access to risk assessment so that they can use that information to help make informed decisions about their safety. But in our experience, we know that risk assessment is not always being done in cases of domestic violence. And when it is, it doesn't always lead to a risk management and safety plan being put into place. Risk assessment is intended to be part of a comprehensive plan that includes safety planning and doing something to mitigate that risk. We also know that in rural communities, it's more common that a family member or a medical professional or a coworker or someone else is figuring out what's going on. So for this reason, we need to get information on intimate partner violence out into communities and into workplaces. The more people that have some information on recognizing and responding to intimate partner violence who might say something if they notice what's going on, that's going to lead to missed opportunities. But funding is necessary to ensure that that prevention education can happen. And we also need funding to ensure that services for victims and services for people who use violence can be as available in rural communities as they are in urban centers. And we need to support access to services for rural people, including increased support for those outreach workers that are providing those services. And I think jurisdictions need to develop frameworks for using risk assessment. And this involves communication among service providers, communication with the people who are impacted, putting a risk management and safety plan into place every time, and seeing that those who have a role to play, such as police and probation, are receiving that information so that they can communicate it and do something to mitigate that risk. So with that, I'll leave it here with a few statements from the National Framework for Collaborative Police Action on Intimate Partner Violence that came out last year. And this shows us that interagency collaboration is key to enhanced community safety. Thank you.
As I said before, when I've been here in Canada, I barely got past the buttons on an elevator, so all these machines are quite the challenge for me. Thanks for inviting me very much indeed, I appreciate it. I want to just talk about where we've been with fatality review. I direct the National Domestic Violence Death Review Initiative in the United States, and I've been involved with work here with Peter in Canada and many other people, folks in Portugal and the UK and Australia, New Zealand as well. So I've been doing this for a while, and Peter gave me a chance to reflect on this. So I want to talk about where we've been, what the challenges are, and future directions maybe suggested by some of the work that we've done. So to put us all on the same page, we've got this operational definition of domestic violence fatality review teams, or what we call in Canada homicide review teams. And these teams are basically designed to identify those deaths caused by, related to, or somehow traceable to domestic violence. And they're also designed to analyze those deaths quite meticulously and systematically with a view to developing preventive interventions. There's a lot of range, a lot of activities these teams do. There's tremendous variation. So it's hard to encapsulate what we've done really over the last 20 years or so. The methodologies vary, teams vary in their resources. Sometimes we have academics involved in this work, some of whom occasionally, like myself, suffer from academia. So when academics are involved, they'll tell you things like we have to produce scientific samples or representative samples or this or that. This is very difficult with this work because there's so much missing data. There is a clear politic to case selection in some jurisdictions in the United States. There is also the threat, and I think it's a common threat, of trying to impose a grid of understanding on the cases before we even start reviewing the cases. In other words, there's an attempt sometimes by some, whether they be of this ilk or that ilk or this kind of methodologist or that, this kind of political persuasion or that, to explain the deaths in certain ways, in certain terms, and that too is problematic. It's like putting the cart before the horse. So we've been there, we've been through some of those things. There are clearly many problems obtaining information with the missing data issue. But there are also concerns around confidentiality and privacy and what we share, and our bottom line is that we want to do no harm. And that's a really important thing, I think, that we've learned. We've learned that team membership ought to be inclusive and creative, bringing folks in from all walks of life who have been touched by these cases. Ideally, we have at our heart the study of ways of life, ways people lived their lives. Particularly, we want to recreate the case through the eyes of the victim, ultimately the decedent, and others who were involved in the case. We want to involve family members, surviving family, community members, co-workers, friends, maybe even neighbors or others. We also want to run our analyses, our reviews of these cases sometimes when we collect aggregate data through community groups, perhaps groups of battered women who understand what's going on in systems, to run those recommendations by those folks. So we introduce over the years, and a number of review teams in the US have done this, sort of community feedback loops. So again, we've been there, we recognize the virtues of doing that as we work teams. It's very clear from both the research literature and the homicide review literature that intimate partner homicide is profoundly gendered. This is something that men mostly commit, direct that behavior at women. There are cases, obviously, where women commit homicides. In many of those cases, women are prior victims of battering, but not always. But clearly, there are other trends here that we have to pay attention to. Actually, I'm sorry, what am I doing here? I'm supposed to be forwarding these things. Okay, you told me that wouldn't work, Peter, right? Okay, so the social patterning, this is an anecdotal observation from 20 years of work, but I think it's fair to say that roughly half these cases involve victims, decedents ultimately, who do not come to the attention of systems in general. In other words, they have no contact with agencies. Those folks die in isolation or relative isolation. And then there are probably another roughly half of the cases where victims have substantial contact with systems, but those systems had very little collaboration, communication, coordination of their activities regarding the case. And we've heard that here already at the conference today with some of the stories and the case histories. So it's very clear that we've got a lot of work to do in terms of missed opportunities, but we've at least established that there are those patterns. But these are stylized killings. We know this. There are patterns to them. There are antecedents. Some have framed these as risk markers. But nevertheless, our risk literature in some ways parallels our fatality review literature. So when we read the reports and we read the risk literature, pioneers like Randy and Jackie have done this work, we do see similarities, and that too is encouraging, that sort of corroboration. It's important too to face the fact that sometimes women kill men in situations where those women are aggressors, where they themselves may be batterers, where they themselves may have been subject to biographies of victimization in the past, just as male perpetrators themselves sometimes are. So these are important issues to bear in mind. Now, why isn't that going? There we go. There's Mark Twain. And this is a rather vulgar quote, but I like it. Most people, Mark Twain said, most people use statistics like a drunk man, and we should bold man, uses a lamppost, more for support than illumination. Now, what did he mean by that? What do I use that for? If we listen to the statisticians and the politicians, they'll tell us that over the last 20 or 30 years, the intimate partner homicide rate has declined. And that's true. These are eminently countable statistics because we often, not always because of the missing cases, we often are able to count relatively easily. So we might be misled by that graph into thinking that things are improving. They may be, but they may not be. The same we see here in Canada with the relative decline from 1993. I'm going to talk now a little bit about some general changes, if I can get this to line up, which I can't. Okay, there we go. So, some folks have looked very specifically at what death review teams have done and tried to track changes that have been introduced because of fatality review activities. Some research in Washington documented changes made in providing services for battered women, for example, with limited English proficiency because of some killings that occurred in that state. Likewise, police had introduced screening to detect suicidal abusers, and knowing full well that if they're suicidal, there is a threat of homicide to those around them. There are other specific changes that we have listed up on our website, which is ndvfri.org, which you can see. There are various cards that people have produced to track offenders, called the HOPE card, which is fairly well known in the United States. It's just a card with a coded message and order of protection that folks can carry around with them, rather like a credit card. There are numerous systems changes that have been made as a result of fatality review. And again, if you go to our website, you read the reports, or you go to the Canadian website, you can see the kinds of changes that have been made. But it's very difficult for us to track those changes, and we'll see that when I talk about this a little bit later. So what challenges do we face? What can we take away from this work? The first thing that we need to say is that fatality review, homicide review is a methodology. It's a way of knowing. If we do it in conjunction with community work, then clearly we can build community, we can build intervention and coordination through the process of reviewing the case. So there is that organic activity of reviewing and coming together around an emotionally charged issue. But fatality review cannot clearly compensate for these various socio-historical horrors that we've been hearing about over the last couple of days. You know, there's no way that it can compensate for the horrors, the terrors of, for example, colonization of indigenous peoples, both here in the United States or indeed elsewhere. It's not going to be able to deal with issues related to the globalization of capitalism, automation, you know, the rise of bureaucracies, disenchanting bureaucracies. These are huge social changes that the review teams will perhaps detect in the work that they do, but can do directly little about. So there are limits to what review activity can do. And these things, these developments, these massive economic developments affect tax bases and they affect infrastructures. The way we organize economies, the way we tax and redistribute or maldistribute wealth, if you like, are critically important for battered women and their families. Those are conscious political choices. And again, teams reflecting on those and informing those decisions might be useful, but to date, teams haven't been able to see those as anything other than challenges. Now, when we look at trends in the United States, it's very clear that the steepest declines have been in marginalized communities, particularly in the inner city. African American males have been the principal beneficiaries, along with, to a lesser extent, African American females, in terms of the lowering of the homicide rates. But we also need to factor in medical advances, changes in emergency medical services, and I'm going to get there in just a moment. It's very clear that the development of community policing brought emergency services, emergency medical services, to the inner city in the United States in a much faster way. We think that's lowered the death rate significantly, at the same time as perhaps creating higher rates of aggravated assault. That's what the data seems to suggest. Now, some research has shown that without those rapid medical interventions, and the research of Harris et al. Published in 2002 originally addresses this. We need more research. It's very clear that the 15 to 20,000 homicides in the US in general, not intimate partner homicides, but homicides, would have been 45 to 70,000 without those medical interventions. And Harris et al. Reckoned that about 2.5 to 4.5% improvement in the homicide rate, or artificial lowering of the homicide rate, occurs every year because of the rise of things like trauma centers and these effects. So we've got better at saving lives. We haven't necessarily become more peaceful or pacified or self-controlled. The CDC data in the US supports this. We know this is a major challenge. If you look at the CDC data from 2001 through 2011, it's clear that roughly those people wounded seriously enough by gunshots to require either a hospital stay, some kind of a hospital stay as opposed to treatment or release, rose almost by half over that decade. So these are cautionary notes for us. And when we look at the British research, Sylvia Walby's research, which we need to replicate in other democratic societies that have the statistical capacity to do this, it's clear from Walby's research, which was published in the British Journal of Crime in 2015, that the practice of capping multiple assaults, and the Brits cap them at 5, in other words, you don't count over 5, when you actually count the real number of assaults, violence against women in the UK has actually increased significantly since the 2008 recession. And we see the same thing in the United States, even with the familicides. So these are causes for concern too. These are challenges. Other challenges that we have are clearly related to the outcomes, potential outcomes of fatality review work. We don't know the effect of review work. What we need is to know, I think, about at least 10 things and maybe more. We need to know how review team recommendations are implemented, how that gets done, what the machinery of implementation is, what effect that has, and whether that's contributed to by other social change agents as well. We need to document changes in law and law-like systems, systems of rules. We need to document team expansion. We need to document public education and awareness and track this concerning domestic violence. We need to measure the more ethereal things that are more difficult to track, things like shifts in what I call the 3 C's, communication, coordination, collaboration of resources. Working together seems to hold out a lot of hope, and I'll address that when I conclude, perhaps more hopefully. We need to get this sense of how fatality review or other coordinated community responses change the level of integration and the focus, the train of the gaze of the state on these disturbing cases. We also need to track rates of IPV, IPH, and other DV-related deaths, including the suicides. I mean, we suspect that we lose more battered women to suicide a year exiting violent relationships than we do to homicide. And this is a reality. We need to get to grips with that. So we need to track those changes, bearing in mind, too, controlling for the impact of medical interventions. I think, too, we need to look at the way resource mobilization occurs And this too is a challenge. How do we garner more resources to do the vital work that we need? We've heard a lot about the deprivation of resources, the dearth of resources in Aboriginal and remote and rural communities in this conference. We need to focus more carefully on that and how we can use reviews to cogently argue for more resources. More difficult to document, but nevertheless important to document, are things like attitudinal shifts and even actual behavioral changes in relationships that may reflect changes in people's behavior, the way the system has worked to encourage different forms of intimacy. And then we obviously also need to look at fatality review teams' links to government and the machinery of changing things at legislative levels. And then finally, I think, exploring the links between fatality review and risk assessment and how they comport with each other or don't, and some of the issues related to risk assessment. So I'd like to say also now a few words about future directions. And I'm going to focus on 4 things. I'm going to focus on new questions or issues, surviving children, working with perpetrators, and the virtues of working together. And I'm actually wrestling with 3 screens here because I'm getting a pop-up menu here as well. So I want you to know how sophisticated this actually is, if I may be so bold. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm now wrestling with a 4th form of interference. Thank you, Marcy. Questions that come up all the time. I review cases frequently. I go to communities. I still serve on the Indian Country Review team up in Montana. I've been a member since we formed that team. Why doesn't he leave? What about the emotional condition of perpetrators? What about problematic notions of control? The notion of control is problematic. I don't care for the concept, I have to say, of coercive control, because to me it implies control is realized. And I've quizzed Evan Stark on this, and he still won't answer my question. But basically, to imply that women are totally controlled is to fly in the face of the resistive maneuverability of women that we see all the time in death reviews, right to the end, that desire to survive and to work things through for them and their kids. So these are complicated questions. We have to deal with the shame and humiliated fury of perpetrators and the links between that and power and control. No one's saying that these men don't feel powerful or entitled or privileged, but they also are deeply humiliated often. Large numbers of intimate terrorists are deeply humiliated by who they are as men. And we have to begin to wrestle with some of these issues. People tell us that anger management and anger is less important and peripheral or derivative of the power and control dynamic. My read of these cases is that anger is central as an emotion, and that as an articulated behavior related to that, the aggressiveness that goes with uncontrolled anger is also important. We have somehow to think about those things. We have to challenge issues about women's syndrome, cycles of violence, learned helplessness, the stock scripts that don't recognize the complexity in battered women's lives, decedents' lives, even men's lives who die in these cases. It's more complicated than that. We deal with issues of mental illness, with drug abuse. These are very difficult issues to weave into the fabric of a simplistic power and control wheel. It's too crude and it's too inflexible. I now want to move on and say a few words about kids. 3,000 or 4,000 kids a year in the United States are orphaned in these cases. Many of those kids see the deaths, clean up the blood, deal with the crime scenes. Fatality review teams know that those kids exist. We've known that for 20 years. But systematically, it's not been their job to address this. So in Arizona, one thing we did this year, not this year, 3 years ago actually, and Peter's been involved in this, is to launch our Arizona Child and Adolescent Survivor Initiative, where we are now providing wraparound services, intensive grief counseling for the complex issues the kids deal with, mentorship programs, material support, Victims of Crime Act support, legal support, estate planning support, etc. And plus peer support groups for those kids. We're now serving 70 children in the state of Arizona and roughly 70 new caregivers who've assumed the responsibilities of working with those children, caring for those children. We have a number of other states in the US that are interested in doing this. We would love to set up a national initiative to do this. It's very important work. This is one of the things, one of the challenges I think that we face. Those kids, as you know, experience complicated trauma. They have many, many aspects to their life, from nightmares, flashbacks, headaches, etc., etc. So these are the things we're dealing with the kids. Tense feelings of shame, suicidality, etc. We have to deal with perpetrators. Perpetrators suffer a lot of trauma in their lives. We need to interview perpetrators when we do death reviews, and we need to realize, as James Gilligan, James Garbarino point out in their wonderful work, that these guys experience trauma too. We want to focus on trauma. We've got to focus on perpetrators and work with them, bearing in mind that some of them claim amnesia and some of them genuinely suffer from dissociative amnesia. And I will talk too about, at other times, men I've interviewed over the years. I've only interviewed probably 40 or 50 people who've killed in prison, and I have to say, I see that commonly. It's very sad. So let's get to the positive now that Peter asked me to address. First of all, when you go in for a medical procedure, they may tell you that you've got a 0.01 chance of some negative outcome occurring. They won't tell you in the United States that 250,000 people die from preventable medical errors every year. They won't tell you that. Now, Randy showed a picture of his puppy today, so I had to be contrary, and I wanted to show a radioactive wolf from the Chernobyl area, just to sort of play out the binary. So I'm a man of binaries too, I guess. You know, Chernobyl happened, and there's a 1,000 square mile plus exclusion zone because the Soviets didn't talk with each other. They didn't work together. They knew for 20 years. They had a lot of accidents. They didn't review them. There were mishaps. Small errors build to large errors. So we've got errors in medicine, we've got errors in the nuclear fuel industry, and then we have aircraft crashes. Chesley Sullenberger landed that plane on the Hudson River 8 years ago after he flew his plane into a flock of geese, and he landed it successfully. And I found this lovely quote from him. I'm fighting with my pop-up menu again. But he said, you take a team of experts and you make them an expert team. That's why aviation safety is so much further advanced than that in medicine and nuclear power, because they listen to each other. The pilot has an interest in doing that because they're going to go down with the plane. I get that. The medical folks have problems with lawsuits, but the folks talk to each other in aviation. And if we can talk to each other doing fatality review, we can do something about these tragedies. I want to close, because Marcy's going to get to me in just a second. There she goes again, another pop-up. I want to close with a quote from Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and a tribute to Eleanor Roosevelt after she died. I've lost more than a beloved friend. I've lost an inspiration. She would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world. So is it not possible that if we can do our review work well, with respect, through the complex lens of the lives of lost loved ones, and in homage to them, that we can warm the world a little? Do we not owe victims at least that, and indeed much, much more? Thank you.
I'm from Saskatchewan. I don't have any pictures of cute puppies or rainbow wolves. I've chosen to show some images of our province, however, for two reasons. One is I think Saskatchewan gets a bad rap for being kind of a boring place, and also because I'm talking about the impact of physical and social isolation that happens in rural and remote areas. And some of these pictures will help maybe bring that forward. If you can imagine that you're in a situation where you're being abused and this is what's outside your back door or your front door if you're to leave. Saskatchewan has the dubious distinction of consistently having the highest per capita rate of family violence, intimate partner violence, and child abuse among the Canadian provinces, at more than double the national rate. The rates of abuse of seniors and sexual assault are also among the highest among the provinces. We're very careful when speaking of these statistics to add the qualifier among the provinces, as the rates in the territories are exponentially higher. The rural, remote, and northern nature of parts of Saskatchewan and all of the territories are common factors to explore when trying to understand why this is. There is ample evidence to show that rates of violence are higher in rural and remote areas. In Canada, that's exemplified in the prairie provinces and the territories. Many speakers at this conference have explained the importance of domestic homicide reviews to understand the unique risk factors in each case and each community. Some jurisdictions, such as Ontario, have been conducting reviews for many years and have seen recommendations coming from the review panels implemented. And though there may have not been formal evaluations of the impact of implementing these recommendations, it's tempting to draw conclusions from the statistics. And I include BC in the province that has done a lot of work in this area, and I think the numbers show. So, for example, in 2015, this is numbers from Stats Canada, Ontario's rate of police-reported intimate partner violence was 226 per 100,000. While Saskatchewan's rate was nearly triple that, at 666 per 100,000. The risk factors that come with a rural and remote population base may remain constant, but efforts to mitigate those factors can do much to impact the experiences of those whose lives are touched by violence. In Saskatchewan, the first domestic violence death review was held in the last year as a pilot process, with no guarantee of future reviews taking place or any commitment to implement recommendations. Still, for those of us working to address intimate partner violence, it feels like a big leap forward. Here I must take a moment to commend Marianne Rich, who spoke so movingly yesterday about her sister Shirley. Her decision to go public with the grief experienced by her family was, I believe, a major factor in the decision by the government of Saskatchewan to begin the domestic violence review process, along with pressure from community organizations such as PATHS. I've been privileged to be part of that review process. Unfortunately, the final report has not yet been released. Oops, sorry. So the graphic that's here on this screen shows the location of domestic homicides that occurred in Saskatchewan from 2005 to 2014. The dark blue indicates homicides that occurred in large urban areas, and the red indicates those that happened in small urban areas. All the rest took place in rural areas, on First Nations, or in the Northern Administration District. And as you can see by that, the majority of the homicides did take place outside of urban areas. Other speakers in the last 2 days have touched on the risks caused by the presence of firearms. The presence of firearms in rural and remote areas is almost a given. Not only does the presence of firearms mean that the risk of suicide or homicide is higher, but it also contributes to the intimidation of victims. The threat of gun violence can be implied without saying a word. It certainly makes it harder if you're trying to apply for a no-contact order. Did he threaten you? No. But I know that many violence against women advocates have fought passionately for gun control legislation, and the long gun registration, which was once a resource accessible to law enforcement, is sadly no longer available in Canada. It may be that the presence of firearms in rural, remote, and northern homes is a reality that will never change, in which case we must look to how we can mitigate the risks they pose. We can imagine the impact that physical isolation has on those at risk of violence. There are no neighbors to hear an assault occurring, no one to intervene or call the police on your behalf. If you are a woman experiencing the psychological manipulation that is often part of living with an abusive partner, you will have learned that you need to gauge his moods. You have already come up with strategies to divert violence when possible. You will likely know when a physical assault is about to happen. A woman in that situation is making multiple calculations in her mind. Can I distract him? If he becomes violent, how serious will it be? Who could I call for help? And how long will it take before help can arrive? What if I do call the police and when they arrive, everything seems fine? What will he do when they leave? These calculations underline the importance of safety planning. Rural areas may be more likely to hold on to traditional family values. A woman may try to reach out to family or friends only to be told that it is her duty to keep the family together. In small communities, everyone knows everyone. If a woman does disclose what she is going through and this information gets into the hand of the wrong person, she may find her family the talk of Coffee Row, which can be a risk for future violence as well. Both victim and offender may feel shame and humiliation for exposing what is thought of as a personal weakness by some. She may never tell anyone what she is going through for fear of what the response will be. She may herself hold traditional family values that override her perception of risk. Women's shelters are few and far between in rural areas. If there's a shelter or a counseling service, chances are that the staff are known to those in the community. And while I'm confident that shelter and counseling service staff will abide by the requirements of confidentiality, there's often a deep discomfort about sharing experiences of abuse with someone that you know. Too often, victims feel shame around abuse. Sometimes it's because they've been led to believe that they deserve it, but often it's because they feel they'll be judged for not leaving sooner. Sometimes women do not perceive the attempts at control, emotional abuse, extreme jealousy, intimidation, or threats of suicide as abuse if physical violence is not occurring, though research shows those to be risk factors for homicide. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself slide-wise. There we go, back one more. It's often assumed that by the general public that a woman who is experiencing abuse should just pick up and leave. For those who live in rural areas, that means not only giving up on her hope for the relationship and a man that she may very well love despite the abuse, but it can also mean leaving behind the only community she's ever known, all family and social connections. If you live in the city and you choose to leave a relationship, you can get a house across town, you can keep your job, your kids can still see their friends, maybe go to the same school. Rural women may also feel more safe at home, either on reserve or at the farm, even while living with their abuser, than they would moving to urban areas due to their fear of the unknown. If you live on a farm in Saskatchewan, chances are that land has been in the family for generations. In case of divorce, separating the marital property is not an easy matter. The possibility of having to break up family land can be unthinkable and something to be avoided at all costs. This may be one reason why rural women may be killed if their partners believe they plan to leave the relationship. And in cases of murder-suicide, we may never know if there was some suggestion from the victim that she maybe had thoughts about leaving that relationship. The use of pets through intimidation to harm or kill as manipulation within a violent relationship is not limited to rural and remote settings. However, owning multiple pets or having livestock that represent a significant financial investment as well as an emotional attachment is far more likely. Shelter workers know that many people choose to remain in unsafe situations rather than leave a beloved animal behind. We have heard from many speakers in the last 2 days about the lasting impacts of intergenerational trauma caused by colonization on our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit population. The very understandable mistrust of Indigenous people for Western systems leads to situations where those who see abuse occurring will not report to authorities, and even victims of violence are reluctant to involve the police. The possibility of dual charging and losing custody of children are realities that Indigenous women face if they choose to call police. Jurisdictional challenges between government social service providers and on-reserve service providers cause barriers to leaving and finding housing and make it easier for people, especially children, to fall through the cracks. When Indigenous women flee their homes on reserve for safety, they're also leaving behind their support system, their families, and in many cases, their connection to culture. There's incredible opportunities to reduce intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicides when recommendations from domestic violence death review committees are implemented. Public awareness campaigns on family violence, increased access to services for both victims and those at risk of using violence, in-school curriculums with age-appropriate information on healthy relationships, and increased support for those exposed to trauma, especially children. Programs such as Neighbours, Friends and Family and Make It Our Business, which were developed right here in London in response to the Ontario Death Review Committee recommendations, help those who may see warning signs safely intervene. And again, this is a theme that's seen over and over again in the death reviews. Although the victims may not have reached out to service providers, people knew, people close to the victims knew, and we need to make sure that people know what to look for and how to safely provide support and intervene. Considerable work is now being done on the link between the abuse of animals and family violence. Some shelters have put into place partnerships with local animal shelters or veterinarians, and some are even making arrangements to have pets stay in shelter with their owners. This morning I sat in on a presentation about a safety planning tool developed in New Brunswick that was designed for rural women who are choosing not to leave their relationships in order to help them stay more safely. And I think we hear that too from our Indigenous partners, that they don't necessarily want to leave, they want to be able to work together to provide safety for both men and women. At the same presentation this morning, I heard about the distribution of trigger locks for guns under the premise of keeping children safe from gun accidents. So not saying it's so that, to prevent intimate partner violence, something else, but now it's a tool there that's in the home for safety. I think we need to encourage communities to come together to address family violence as the public health issue that it is. Rural communities pride themselves on being there to help each other in times of trouble. We need to get family violence out in the open and encourage everyone to care for their neighbor. Indigenous communities can use traditional teachings to help heal past trauma in order to overcome resistance to involving what's sometimes called the white man's law in cases of domestic violence. Indigenous communities can develop their own protocols and standards for safely intervening. There's a number of good programs out there, including Awakening the Warrior Within, which I attended part of that presentation this afternoon, and it was great. I think we all have a responsibility to look at the Truth and Reconciliation report and to see which of those recommendations we need to implement and reach out to our Indigenous communities and start to reduce the systemic racism that is simmering under the surface, unfortunately, here in Canada. Too often, supports are offered to women and children only after violence has occurred, and there's no treatment offered to the offender. While removing the woman and children from an abusive situation may be imperative for her safety, unless we provide treatment to the offender, he will simply transfer the abuse to his next partner. When we acknowledge that offenders were often victims too, we can offer support in non-judgmental ways. Thank you.